Hi, I'm Terzel Vasquez, producer at Stat Brand Studio, here at JPM 2026, joined by John Stanford, founder and executive director of Incubate. John, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. Excited for this conversation.
So Incubate represents early-stage biotech investors and startups. How much do today's Washington policy signals actually change investor behavior, such as where capital flows, what gets funded, and whether investors stay in the sector at all?
Well, it's a great question, and thanks again for having us. Stat is integral to our job of getting policymakers to understand the life sciences. So keep doing what you're doing. Thanks for having us on. In terms of how we think about investor behavior and policy, capital flows like water, and it's going to dodge the rocks in the stream that are policy barriers, and it's going to chase after those shallow areas that have more attractive incentives created by policy. At Incubate, we got to test this in real time a few years ago with the Inflation Reduction Act. So the IRA puts price controls in place and even does some very specific things like decreased incentives for small molecules. So you only get 9 years of rewards versus 13 years for biologics. We have something called the Life Science Investment Tracker, and we immediately started measuring decreased investment. We knew we'd have to, as the kids say, bring the receipts in order to go to policymakers and say, hey, you made a mistake here. We can debate price controls broadly, but I don't think you meant to see money flow out of small molecule, this so-called pill penalty, and that's exactly what we saw, because sometimes this is an industry that cries wolf. We didn't want to be that. We didn't want to say the sky is falling and innovation is over. But we wanted to say what you've done here is caused lack of interest by investors. Rare disease is another great example. The IRA said you couldn't chase after secondary indication. Overnight, money goes out of rare disease. The great news is, the positive news, is that in July we fixed that problem, and we're already tracking $1 billion that we wouldn't have expected to see in rare disease. And I'll also just add, we just released our survey of investor trends. 3 out of 4 investors say they are more interested in rare disease following the fix to that law. So capital flows like water. Washington, when they set good policy, we chase after it. The sector, even more broadly, when Washington and FDA uncertainty, for example, something that Stat's been talking about, that casts uncertainty over the whole industry, and we see that money, that capital flow to a whole other sector, which is bad for patients.
You've argued that policies aimed at big pharma actually ripple down to venture-backed biotechs and the entire innovation pipeline. How do proposals like MFN-style international benchmarking or other price controls affect the ability of startups to raise capital and achieve exits?
You know, something we deal with when we talk to members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, I'll pick on both of them. There's this strange cognitive dissonance where they want to champion U.S. small biotech, but they really want to beat up on big, bad, large pharma. And, you know, politically that may make sense, but, you know, as one of my good friends, Johannes Fruhauf at Mission Biocapital and Biolabs, he talks about it being a relay race. Small biotech is not the last runner of the relay race. It's handing off a baton maybe it took from academia or somewhere else to get an asset. You know, they hand off that baton to large manufacturers who have the experience to see a drug over the finish line, get it to patients. Another analogy I heard this week that I really like is, think of movies, you know, an independent film, you know, this is why you see all those logos at the beginning of a movie. An independent film studio presents something at Cannes or Toronto, and Warner Brothers sees it, or whoever's going to buy Warner Brothers sees it, and they bring it to the masses. What something like MFN does is attacks the end of that value chain. It beats up on Warner Brothers. Well, if Warner Brothers doesn't have as much in its budget, it's going to buy less movies, and we, the moviegoers, see less movies. And it's exactly the same as patients. When we beat up on the end of the value chain as investors, we may call them big pharma in Washington, we call them customers. We call them the acquirers. And so when you narrow that pool through things like price controls, through efforts to make MFN permanent and codify it, when you do that, you are decreasing the pool that those manufacturers will spend on large biotech, which only, it's a bit of a paradox. The same people who push those kinds of, frankly, bad proposals are the same people worried about China taking over the US biotech ecosystem and we're going to lose our global edge. Those things are at odds. If you put price controls in place and decrease the ability for manufacturers to recoup their investments and be profitable, you force them to look for the cheapest possible alternative. Well, where is that? It's in China. So the very same people who want to see that onshoring are trying to remove the ability for the large companies to be able to afford to do that innovation in the United States. So we're very concerned that efforts to expand price controls, that MFN, if you beat up the end of that value chain, we're going to have less movies, less medicines. And that's something we're really working with policymakers to explore. The last thing I'll say on it is whatever study you want to go with, that the IRA and MFN are taking $100 billion out of the industry, taking $300 billion out of the industry. How can that not have an impact on the early stage ecosystem? It's not comprehensible to say, oh great, our early stage ecosystem will be strong, but we can take $300 billion out of this industry. And so it's time for policymakers to maybe set aside the politics of this issue and maybe focus on the reality that it's an ecosystem and it's fundamentally connected.
China is investing very heavily in biotech right now. What does this mean for the United States competing against China?
I think we have to remember that this is not the China of yesteryear or yesterdecade. They have more chemists, they have more energy, they have more funding. China has put, we released something last year, China has put a green light in every possible way to be a global leader in biopharma. And we're putting up, at best, yellow lights, shutting down SBIR, MFN. We've got blinking yellow, we've got red lights to our ecosystem. And China is absolutely running with it, and it begs a very serious question. I was on a panel yesterday that it got raised. What happens when a large Chinese pharmaceutical comes up with the cure for diabetes because we ceded this leadership? We're not that far off from that reality, and we have to take some pretty serious steps now to turn on the spigot instead of turning off the spigot. One last thing I'd add about China, I had the pleasure yesterday of sitting with Michelle Rozo, who is the vice chair of Congress's Commission on Emerging Biotech, which put out this incredible report about how we stay competitive with China. One of the things that came out of our conversation yesterday is we talk about biotech and biomanufacturing as this strategic asset. We're moving from this is just a piece of healthcare into this is a national security prerogative. And I think what's interesting about that conversation is the manufacturers who take definitely their fair share of hits and have spent a lot of time with the White House crafting these deals, they're a strategic asset as well. When you look at the Chinese landscape, the one thing they're missing is a truly reputable global manufacturer, and we know that's where they want to go next. So I think some of the conversations we're having really need to treat the whole ecosystem, not just that early stage entrepreneur, as a truly strategic asset.
There's been constant pressures to just lower drug prices. From Incubate's perspective, why is it not that simple? And what gets missed in that framing?
It is the $3 billion question, frankly, because that's what the average drug coming to market costs, about $3 billion over the course of 15 years. A new drug is just not meant to be affordable to an individual, to you or me. And I'm not just talking about $5 million gene therapies. I'm talking about $200 a month chronic disease treatments that make meaningful difference in people's lives, but Americans can't afford them. That's why we came up with this system called insurance. We came up with a way to say none of us would be able to afford that first pill because the company is looking to recoup $3 billion. And let's remember, they probably need to make a profit on that as well. And so we've got such a fundamental breakdown in insurance. The Kaiser Family Foundation each year puts out the cost of high deductible health plans. We're talking about deductibles in the tens, if not $20,000 for a family of four before insurance kicks in. I like to do something with policymakers. You know, a lot of this drug pricing debate kicked off around Harvoni and Sovaldi, these incredible cures for hepatitis C. And instead of celebrating in that moment that we cured this disease, we focused on this isn't a $100,000 drug. But play this out with me. Let's say the most aggressive wings of each party get their way and we cut drug prices 50%. So that Sovaldi on day one, instead of being $100,000, is $50,000. Well, Gilead's out of business. And I remind people that the average profitability of these companies is 10, 12, 14%. So if you're cutting prices 50%, Gilead's out of business. But can the patient actually afford the medicine? Well, no. If they have a 10% coinsurance, they went from being $10,000 out of pocket to $5,000 out of pocket. Medicines will continue to be unaffordable no matter what we do to the drug industry if we don't fix the root issue that insurance isn't insurance. We shouldn't have out-of-pocket costs for chemo drugs. We shouldn't have out-of-pocket costs for people to take medicines that get them back to work. And so we know that drug pricing is a politically salient issue, but we got to move past those talking points.
John, that's all the questions that we have. Thank you for joining us at Stat Brand Studio, JPM 2026.
So grateful for having me. Thanks.
Thank you.